research. Dr. Guzmán has been in Nature Communications Journal since 2018. Since 2018. Sorry about that.
Okay.
And her duties at the journal includes not 100 years. You're not that old. Her duties at the journal include choosing manuscripts for peer review and overseeing the peer review process, enforcing journal policies, commissioning commentaries and reviews, attending and organizing conferences, and conducting lab visits. But we know Yomayra for already several years now, because I had the pleasure to have Yomayra as my undergraduate research student in my laboratory at the University of Puerto Rico, where she got her bachelor's degree in biology. And after that, while in my lab, she studied the effects of vasopressin in spatial learning. And later, she moved to the city of Chicago, where she received her PhD in neuroscience at Northwestern University, where she studied oxytocin neurotransmission involved in social modeling of fear learning in rodents with Dr. Jelena Rudolovic. And following her PhD, she continued to do a postdoctoral work with Dr. Jeffrey Swanson, also at Northeastern, but this time focusing on the role of kainate receptors in neurodevelopment while conducting this research. So now she's going to talk to us about what has been her career as a scientist and now as a editor in one of the premier scientific journals of our field. So thank you, Yomayra, for being here and sharing with us your presentation. So, adelante.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you, Carmen, for this, Dr. Maldonado, for this kind introduction. And thank you all for being here to hear me talk about my career transition from academia to the publishing industry. And I hope that throughout this presentation, you'll find tips for both navigating your scientific career and the publishing process as well. So before I formally begin, I want to first provide a brief outline of the topics that I want to discuss today. During the first part of my talk, I will focus really on explaining a little bit more about myself and about the opportunities I took and how I transitioned my career to from academia to a non-academic role. In the second part of my talk, then I would go more in detail and discuss what my job entails, what are my editorial duties, as well as the scientific publishing world and peer review, in hopes to sort of lift the veil of what goes on behind the publishing industry. So a little bit about me. I'm a born and raised Puerto Rican, and I am a first-generation college student. And of those two characteristics, I think the second characteristic really has shaped my career progression more than I would have anticipated. And why do I say this? I think that one of the things that I really was missing throughout the career progression was some sort of guidance or parental guidance about what kind of choices we needed to make in order to, you know, have a successful career trajectory. I remember back in the day when I was in high school, my parents sat me down and they said, hey, you have really good grades. That means you have options. You can either be a doctor or a lawyer. And sounds very cartoonish, but actually it was kind of like that. And they had their choices for providing this guidance. I think the first one was they probably really didn't have a lot. They were kind of naive in terms of what careers are there and how careers progress and the extent of the wealth of different careers that exist after a terminal degree. And the second reason was that they thought that these two careers could probably secure me a strong financial future. In retrospect, they were not incorrect about that second point, but they were certainly not correct about that first point. And I think this is one of the main aspects of why being a first-generation college student affected me, in that sense that I was very naive. I had a very naive view of what it meant to get a terminal degree. I thought that once I chose a career, I had to stay in that career forever. And actually, that is not true. And that is Not true for the majority of people that I know that have finished with PhDs in neuroscience, for example. So if there's anything I want you to get out of my talk today, is that not everything that you choose career-wise or training-wise, means it's going to dictate your endpoint. But what is going to dictate your endpoint is the opportunities to start getting along the way. So I love biology. So for me, the choice between lawyer and medical doctor was obvious. I had to go to medicine. So like most pre-med students at UPR, I actually ended up doing a bachelor's degree in biology. And I think this was a very instructive time of my life, because I remember this is when I really started discovering my passion. I got this letter on the mail. It was for an NIH-sponsored program called CORE. I'm not sure if the program still exists. And what they really wanted to do was sort of lure in scientists that wanted to work at the intersection between the biological and the psychological sciences. And I still remember that one of the sentences in that letter, it stated that I could study the biological basis of drug addiction. And at that point, I was in shock and I was very excited. I thought at that point, you're telling me that I could understand very complex human behavior, such as addiction, for example, by just looking at physiological changes in the brain. And I think I am still very passionate about that topic. It's that intersection between trying to understand the mind by looking at the brain. And even though I'm not an academic researcher at this moment, I still feel very passionate about this topic, and I can still use that passion throughout the different careers that I have, different career positions that I have joined throughout my life. Well, I was at CORE. I had the great opportunity to work in Dr. Maldonado's lab, as she mentioned. I studied the role of the neuropeptide vasopressin, specifically in the nucleus accumbens. And I remember learning a lot of surgical skills for small rodents, actually rats in this case, and learning different behavioral techniques to really assess the role of this neuropeptide in learning processes. And it was really at this point where I decided that I loved science and neuroscience particularly more than I was interested in studying, getting a medical degree. So I decided to go towards the PhD route, and I joined Northwestern University, where I completed a PhD in the laboratory of Dr. Jelena Radulovic. And in here, I switched gears a little bit from drug addiction to study anxiety and depression. And I think even though the topic is thematically different, I think the concepts are still the same. What we're looking at is how physical changes, biochemical changes, even structural changes in the brain can lead to different consolidation of experiences that might lead to memories being like strengthened in a way that they probably shouldn't. In this case, what I was looking at was fear behavior. So I was interested in understanding how changes in a particular brain region called the lateral septum were kind of modulating what processes were going to happen after when we learned a fearful event, when not we, but the rodents in this case. And this was a very fruitful time of my life, and I learned a lot of things, and I was really excited about the science. But even then, I started having some doubts, and mainly because I understood the difficulty of getting grants for many PIs. I understood the difficulty of having to juggle the political climate at the institutions and also the science. And lastly, I started noticing that it wasn't enough to just know one thing really well. I think scientists now are being asked in grants and in publishing to know a lot of things. It was no longer enough to cannulate an animal and do the behavior. Now you have to include electrophysiology, and then you have to do some more pharmacology and maybe some human genetics. So things were getting more complicated. And I also started having doubts about how much I was getting out of what I was putting in. However, I was not yet ready to jump ship. So I decided then to go do a postdoctoral position in a place where I could get both technical skills that might help me in case I did wanted to have my own laboratory, and also some space outside of lab where I could grow other skills that are not necessarily going to help me at the bench. And this is where I am very thankful for Professor Jeffrey Swanson at Northwestern University, where I did my postdoc, because he did allow me and he gave me the space to do both, to get something out of his lab while also giving something in return, but also to get some time away from the bench so that I could discover other aspects of science that I enjoy. During this time at Jeff Swanson's lab, I learned electrophysiology, and I also then provided the lab with my biochemistry skills in the moment. And I worked on this nice project in collaboration with this group in Arizona that were doing human genetics, and they found a rare mutation in one child that had a very rare neurodevelopmental disorder that's still unclassified. And what they saw is that it had a mutation in a kainate receptor. So I got a plasmid, and then I started recording from cells, and I noticed that this mutation actually changes the way the receptor behaves, and which might explain then some of the behavioral phenotypes in the human patients. This work was very exciting, but I still had some doubts about where I wanted to be and whether I wanted to become a professor. And I think this doubt's really starting to get stronger as a postdoc. I also started noticing that I needed a little bit more time because I wanted a lot more of a work-life balance. And I thought that for some reason, I really thought that I could get this elsewhere that was not in academia. I also really started to noticing that I really didn't want to delve down into a specific subject. I didn't want to continue with specializing, which is what a lot of professors do. Instead, I wanted to like dip my toes in very different fields, and especially I wanted to do research in things that were more clinically relevant. So then I thought industry was a good chance for me. So because of personal reasons related, I decided to move to New York, and it was here where I found a spot in another academic position, but this time it was in a lab that had a dual academic and pharmaceutical role. So the PI of the lab, he's a biochemist, and he actually found a way to do some protein work and create this vector that would drive things into the nervous system. But he wasn't a neuroscientist, so this was a perfect position for me to join a lab that had, he had his own startup company, and also I worked at NYU. And it was this good bridge between fully academic and pharmaceutical industry. But again, I started feeling like I really didn't want to be at the bench anymore. And throughout my career progression, especially starting as a postdoc, I had started to develop more of a liking towards activities that related to science communication. And I think at this time, I really decided it was time to jump ship. I've been doing academic positions for a while. I'm not satisfied, and I really love science communication and scientific engagement. And this is where I found my job as an editor, because I wanted a life outside of academia, but with science at the forefront. And I think this is specifically what is good about the editorial role I'm at the moment. So like I said, why I became an editor, two things. I love science, and I still love science. I don't think I'm ever gonna stop saying that, but I really didn't want to do bench work. So this was a great way of being still involved in science and learning about science and discussing science. I go to conferences, I talk to professors, I read science every day, but yet I don't have to be at the bench, and I also don't have to manage a lab, which has its own difficulties. So I've been an associate editor for communications biology. It's part of the Nature Research Group, and the Springer Nature Company. And yes, I'm sorry, I think I talk a little bit more than what I wanted for this point, but I think my take-home message from this part is that first, a winding road is normal, and even I think it's pretty acceptable at this point, and most people go through this. But I also think that it's important that even when you don't want to close yourself doors, you have to realize that every decision that you make, it needs to be goal-oriented, and you need to be able to extract something out of it that then you can use to construct your new career path. I also want to highlight that personal goals and needs should be considered when thinking about career paths. Sometimes we like to pretend that work and life are separate and they live in a vacuum, but that's not true, actually. Our personal goals need to be taken into account. And lastly, I think that one thing that I struggle with the most is that not a single job is perfect unless we actually make the most of it. And with this, I want to conclude the first part of my talk. If anyone has questions, I'm not sure if we're supposed to do them at the end, but I'll just continue. You can stop me if you want. So now in this next part of my talk, I want to sort of, like I said, lift the veil of what goes on behind scientific publishing industry. A lot of people find that it's inaccessible, and actually even I, as an author, back when I was in academia, I did not realize how much editors actually want us to reach out to them and to talk about science and to make this seemingly confusing process more transparent. So let me move on. Here we go. So the Journal on Workflow Communications Biology, it's actually an open access research journal that's part of the Nature Research portfolio. And what we're interested in is in manuscripts that make important advances to people working in specialized areas of research. We're also interested in interdisciplinary topics, so like any topic that's bridging two different fields, for example, neuroimmunology as an example. And I think something interesting about our journal, which is not necessarily true for the other Nature research journals, is that we're currently have both professional editors and academic editorial board members. So I handle papers, but I also have a team of experts that are actually PIs. You know, they have their own labs, and they can also help us assess different topics. So I'm not sure why this is not moving forward. Here we go. This is a photo of our team. And so this is the chief editor, Brooke Laflamme, and each of us handles specific areas within, with different topics within the biological science. I am the primary editor for neuroscience and anything related to neurodevelopment and human behavior, which is quite broad. But this is how we're split. So where does my journal fit within the Nature Research portfolio? As you probably all know, there's different tiers of Nature journals. Nature, for example, it's one that it's very selective. It only publishes studies that have the widest and importance and implications that are relevant to multiple fields of research. And then you go to Nature research journals such as Nature Neuroscience, for example, Nature Communications, Communications Biology, and Scientific Reports. And what does it mean that the selectivity of each journal? And I think this really is really nicely illustrated by this picture. I think what they're looking for is broad appeal. So for example, if someone publishes a paper in Nature, what editors are looking for is something that a lot of people are going to find interest. So maybe in this example, you publish this paper in something related to cancer, and maybe a lot of people that are not just cancer biologists are going to find that this is going to be useful or interesting to them. So it's like very broad readership, very broad appeal. And then you start going to more specialized fields from there. So Nature Immunology, they want something that's going to be of interest to all immunologists regardless of their subfield of specialty. For Communications Biology and the other communications journals within this series, we have less selective criteria than Nature, for example, and Nature Neuroscience. But what we're looking for is insights, new insights that are focused into specific areas of research. So now we no longer care if neuroscientists in general are going to find this study interesting. What we want is that the fans of glial biologists, for example, are going to find this of interest. So you go down on specialization across the portfolio. So what happens with peer review? Most of the time, you have this idea that you send in your paper and then that's it. You wait like 4 months for something to happen. Hopefully it's less than 4 months, but I think the target should be around 30 to 60 days. So what happens? You as an author, the first thing that you need to do is try to understand where does your work fit within the editorial niche. What kind of journals are going to be interested in your work, and that's going to maximize your chances of losing, less time. And you do this simply by reading what journals publish and trying to understand what is their, like I said, editorial niche. So once you get the author sends it, the chief editor then processes the journal, and it gets sent to individual editors. Dr. Maldonado, should I answer questions right now, or should we just wait at the end?
At the end. At the end.
So once editors get your paper, so once I get the paper, or an editorial board member, which is essentially a PI, then I quickly read the paper. And out of this paper, I distilled the main facts. So what is the question you're trying to address? What is the novelty that you are presenting? And how does this impact the field? And based on that, I either decide to send your paper out to review or reject it. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about each specific step so that you can get a sense of what is it that we're looking for. After that, if it gets sent to peer review, then we assigned external experts in the field to specifically vet the technical aspects, and then we make another post-review decision. So what is taken into account in this first decision? Like I said, for our journal, this is done by me, an in-house editor, or by an external board member. So we're looking for whether the question is important, if the article is telling us something that is new and that is of interest to others working in the field. We also look for I think very big picture, if the data is well controlled and strong. So I'm not going to go into details about statistical methods or maybe, but if you're like clearly missing a control group, then that's something we might notice. But it's very rarely rejected, desk rejected for technical merits at the beginning. So reasons for rejecting or desk rejection without peer review. It's out of scope. So let's say you're submitting something that's very heavy on the physics aspects, even though it's biophysics, but we think that this finding might be more relevant for physicists rather than biologists. In that case, we consider that out of scope. And then that's one reason for rejecting. Another thing we might reject for is that if we find similar findings have been published already. So let's say conceptually what your new data doesn't really provide new insights. So we actually go on PubMed or Google Scholar, and we actually look for papers in that area and what is known so that we can compare and benchmark. And I think ethical concerns is very rare, but I think that's mainly what we're looking for, which is advanced and how it compares to previous work. So what is important for you as an author to do in order to make sure that the editor, which is the first person that's going to evaluate your paper, gets a sense of what you want to say? And I think this is important because, like I said, if the editors, we don't have a lot of time. I'm handling about, I don't know, 30 papers in a day sometimes, not all first decisions, but still, let's say I have like an hour or 45 minutes at most to understand the key aspects of your paper. Therefore, I think this is where writing becomes really important, and where I think that one needs to really practice the skill so that it's perfected. You need to write a good cover letter. You need to, in the cover letter, highlight the reasons why your work is of interest in the field. Let's say this has been unknown for X amount of time, and it is important for X, Y, and Z. How it fills the gap in literature. Is it a more precise methodology? Does it describe a new tool that's going to be useful for scientists? You also have to clearly state the advance of your work over previous work. And I think this is really important. Sometimes people miss this opportunity to highlight. There might be similar studies, but yours might be different for a particular reason that then makes it more precise in one way or another. And I think that needs to come out on that cover letter. And I think it's important to be honest and give credit to those that came before you. I think it's not good to lie in the cover letter and pretend that no one has ever done what you've done, because editors will likely find it, and it kind of looks bad when you just purposely omitted some work that and actually in most rejection letters, when editors sometimes provide references to those articles that they feel like are in competition in terms of the findings. So what is the framework for a compelling narrative and what you should try to aim to do at an abstract or a cover letter? You should explicitly state what is the question you're trying to answer. You should explicitly say what is known about this question and how does your study fills in that gap. So what is the advance? You should also mention briefly how you answered that question, what does your data show, and also what's your next step. And I think a good abstract is key, not only for editors because it kind of sets the stage for when they go on reading your manuscript, but it's also when PIs are asked to review papers, all they get is the abstract. So if you write a really compelling abstract, you're going to catch the reviewers from the get-go. And I think that's really important. So I always encourage my authors to really work on that abstract and make sure that it's clear, that it doesn't exaggerate things, but that it's at the same time it's very explicit in showing what is the advance of the work. So the second stage, peer review. Let's say your manuscript goes out to peer review, and now it actually goes to the experts. It goes to the PIs and to the people that, or postdocs. Actually, I really encourage postdocs to accept peer review invitations when you feel comfortable doing so. I think it's a good way to get some skills and also to learn. It looks good in a CV. It actually, I think it really helped me get this job. Just the fact that I had interaction and knowledge about the peer review process. So when I ask reviewers to evaluate the work, they're looking for things that are completely different than what I'm looking for. They're looking to see that the conclusions are supported by the data, that the data is of high quality, that there are appropriate controls, both experimental and within the experiment, and that the experimental approach and the analysis actually meet the state of the art of the field, like what's expected at the field at the moment, and also that there are sufficient methodological information so that the study can be replicated. And I think this is a crucial part as well. They can also advise on whether the scientific advance is there, how it would be of interest to the field, and the potential impact that this work might have on future research. I think the second aspect of the word, the more impact and scientific based on just on the perceived impact of the work, even though we always encourage reviewers to, help us and advise us on this, editors can definitely overrule on these points. What we cannot overrule and we will never overrule is on technical concerns, because we're not experts. We can choose which subject we want to publish just based on topics and themes, which is what this advanced question is related, but technical issues are never overruled by editors. So, as I mentioned, reviewer opportunities for postdocs and advanced graduate students. I really encourage students to advanced graduate students to review papers in conjunction with their PI so that they can learn the process, and postdocs to also review papers. And I think I just want to highlight one thing from this slide, and is that Nature has a Nature Masterclass that's for free, and it's on an online course on peer review. So it basically teaches the principles of peer review and what is the goal. So I really encourage people to get this link and access this course. Is for free, and I think it's pretty useful. Okay, so second decision, what happens after peer review? Let's say now we get the comments from the referees and they have raised a series of concerns. Now, I think it's important for people to understand why is it that editors then reject or decide to send manuscripts out, give authors a chance to revise their manuscript. Reasons why a manuscript is rejected. The first one is technical concerns. So if the reviewers raise issues that we believe cannot be addressed with additional experiments, let's say there's a fundamental flaw in the experimental design that doesn't allow you to practically answer that question, then that's a major reason for rejection, because there's just no way of fixing it without you having to redo the entire work. Another reason is substantial revisions that are actually more than should be expected from a general revise cycle. Let's say that maybe they're all minor concerns, but there's just too many of them, in which case it's going to take you a whole year to like redo. That's another reason why sometimes papers get rejected. Unsubstantiated claims. This has to do with maybe your main claim, the reason why we just thought your manuscript fit within our editorial niche is not actually supported by the data for whatever reason. That's also another reason for rejection. There's also impact concerns, and these are, I want to point out that these are rare, but they're less rare for more selected journals. So what this means is really when the reviewers state that the claims are not novel or that they do not represent a substantial advance in the field. Maybe we missed some reference in our original assessment, or maybe the main claim, which is the novel claim, is not substantiated by the data, but then what you have left are claims that are not novel, in which case we would also reject the manuscript. And another reason, which is extremely rare, I don't think I've ever had to reject a paper based on ethical issues, although it has happened, it's concerns over ethics. I think it tends to happen a lot in other fields of studies, not as much as in neuroscience. So I want to provide now some tips for addressing the referee reports. I think the main thing that I've noticed that it's not fruitful is when authors get combative. I never think this is a good way. I mean, ultimately, editors, once we decide to send a manuscript out for review, we take the referee's advice. We also take the author's advice. We're mediators, but there needs to be some sort of nice dialogue between them, right? So being extremely combative in your responses to the reviewers, even though you're mad, is not helpful, actually. It's actually really impedes the review process, and it doesn't lead to constructive criticism in any way. So take the concerns that the reviewers raise as an opportunity to engage with them, to understand, to make your work better. It might be that you didn't express something as clearly as you thought you did. So this is a good chance. It's also not good to just brush things off of like, oh, I'm more senior, they don't know. That's also not helpful. It actually makes referees really mad because they are taking time off for free, and they are taking time to help you evaluate your work in different light. So I think, you need to be kind to referees, and I also exhort my referees to be kind to the authors and be constructive in their criticism and not overly critical. And I think one thing that I didn't know as an author that I want everyone to know today is that when you have doubts about anything in the reviewer concern report, you can always ask the editors. As I said, our job is to be mediators. We're there to make sure that there is good communication between authors and the referees, and we want this process to work. So if you have questions, ask me, and I'll either, if I can't answer the question by myself, I will, go to the referee or the reviewer, and I will ask him or her about how should that question be addressed. So no, I don't think so. This is for appeals. I also didn't know as an author that I could appeal a decision made by an editor. And I think this is important for you to know. If you think an editor made a mistake, we're humans. We don't pretend to be perfect, and we also are not actually in the pleasure of like wanting to destroy people's manuscripts. We actually enjoy when things get published and, to get positive feedback for the authors. So if you think we made a mistake, reach out to us and tell us what is the mistake. Be specific, please. Don't tell me, and I've had emails like this, do you know who I am? I am X and Y, I am super famous, and people love me. That is not helpful. Be very specific about the science that you want, and speak science. Like, I don't want celebrity endorsements. I don't want cosmetic revisions. I mean, we want this to be as mature as possible. And also, if you have new data that addresses the criticism, that's also good. I think I have a really good story about this paper that I rejected. And it turns out that my decision was right. Because the referee thought that there was a critical point that they were missing on their methods. It turns out the referee had misread the sentence. And we reverted the appeal, and the manuscript got published in the end. And it was a win-win situation. Everyone was happy, including the referee. And the paper is highly cited now. So it's a good story. Don't be afraid to reach an appeal if you have strong reasons to believe that there was an error. So my manuscript was rejected. What should I do? And with this, I want to emphasize the importance, especially within Nature Research Group, of the transfer cascade. So let's say a paper, and this happens to me a lot. I get a lot of papers from Nature Communication that are technically sound, but are rejected based on impact. Remember, I said that we tend not to reject on impact as much as other journals because of their selectivity. But I've had really good papers that have been seen by referees. They're in round 2 or first, and they're going to be rejected. And instead of having to withdraw the paper and resend somewhere else, what we do with the transfer cascade is that we can just import all of that. And then instead of restarting the process, we can reach out to the same referees. And now you had a paper that instead of having to start from scratch, it can now just go ahead and get published. And this has also happened to us. And I think this is a service that I really think is useful for authors. So with this, I want to just finish my talk on the editorial summaries, and I hope that there are some questions that we can talk about. But before I begin, I want to give, I want to give a brief summary about what we spoke today. I really think it's important for you to understand the editorial criteria and to visualize editors as mediators. We're not there to kill your paper. We're there actually, we want to help find authors a good place for their paper where we think it's going to have them best and maximize their impact. So before you submit, please get familiarized with yourself with the journal policies, the review process, and the editorial criteria. I think this is going to really help authors not waste time during this process. Make sure that your message is clear to the editor, to the reviewers, and eventually to the readers. I think this is a really good way of maximizing the impact of your paper. And lastly, I think that by focusing on the audience, so your ultimate readers, on transparent reporting, making sure that what you're doing and your data can be replicated by others. This is a thing that's really affecting science right now. And actually, there's very good initiatives by the NIH now trying to make sure that reporting is more transparent so that we can replicate each other's work and not miss so many resources. And also data accessibility. So now there's a big push from a lot of publishers trying to get data out there so that maybe people have data sets that can be evaluated by others. I think a good example of this would be on sex differences research. Many times now, because of NIH mandates, people are using both female rats, male and female rats for studies, but then they're grouping their statistics, so you can't really know if there are sex differences what you're looking for. But if the data is public and easily accessible, then maybe someone else interested in that can gain access and also do their analysis. So this is a good way of like sharing resources, which are, more and more scarce now in science. And lastly, when in doubt, ask the editor. We're here to help, and we're happy to have questions. And with that, I want to thank you all for being here. And here's my contact information and our journal's webpage. Have any questions? I'm happy to take them.
Gracias. Thank you, Yomayra, for a very, very interesting presentation about the ins and outs of publishing and your career path. That gives us an overview of how we can after a very strong background in science, we can still be, a scientist, but in a different scenario. So appreciate you sharing that with us. We have a couple of questions, and the first one is one of your slides. Dr. Garcia says, it is difficult not to notice that most of the members in your team are females. Common editorial business, what makes this science area more attractive to women scientists?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. And I mean, I'm being really biased here. It's just because I asked myself the same thing when I first joined my lab. But I wouldn't be that excited about a strong female presence in the editorial community. It does seem that there's more women in science writing and editorial. But when you go higher up, like the bosses of the women and the top and the top and the top, they're actually male. So I think, I don't know why that is. But it is true. I think most editorial positions at my level, including editorial chiefs and editorial, are women. It's very common. I think that's very noticeable also in across all journals. I think the reason might be the flexibility in the work schedule, which allows for, unfortunately, a lot of women are still the main primary caregivers, even working moms. And I think this job, particularly because of the flexibility in the work hours, even though we're work 40 hours plus, but they're very flexible. You can do them, you don't have to be there for an experiment or running a Western blot or doing this or that. And I think maybe that's it, but that's also true for other careers. I can't really answer that, but that's a good point.
Okay. Then there's this other question. A common belief among scientists is that it is more difficult to pass the first editor review than the second peer review. What is your experience?
So you mean the desk rejection? I'm assuming that's what, yeah, the editor. Okay. That I guess that depends. That depends on the journal. So I think that would definitely be true for a journal that publishes, I don't know, only 10% of the papers that get submitted to them. Like, for example, if you're published, Nature gets like, I don't know, let's say they get 100 papers in a day and they only publish like 30 in a month or something like that. So I think that depends on the journal level and the tier, basically. For our journal, I don't think that's necessarily true. In fact, I would say that in my case, it would be the opposite, just because we're really not looking at technical merits as much because we don't have time for it. We're basically just looking at scope. I know that I end up rejecting a lot of manuscripts post-review based on technical problems that I couldn't possibly assess during my initial assessment. So like I said, I think it depends on the tier of the journal.
Okay. And then there's another question. Other than knowing the science, what skills do you develop as a research scientist that are useful for you now as an editor?
Like I mentioned, I think it's really important for me was actually being a reviewer. That was really useful as an editor because I think I could see both sides of the coin. I think sometimes as authors, we tend to judge reviewers really harshly and we forget that we have been reviewers too. I think science communication in general is a good thing. Just practicing talks and going to conferences, all things that you actually do as a PI are as a graduate student or postdoc are skills that you need for an editor. So I think communication skills and something that not a lot of people have experience, but they should, is actually doing peer review.
Okay. And then another question, how the selection of the reviewers for the specific manuscript is done in communication biology? You pick from ones included in the cover letter or you select your own?
That's a great question. And I think every editor does it differently. I like when they give me editors in the cover, suggested reviewers in the cover letter, because it helps me sort of find similar people. If I, for some reason, you'll be surprised how many people you have to ask to review. So let me just give you an example. Sometimes I have a manuscript that I have to ask 30 people in order to get 3 people to review it. So that's the hardest part of the job. So when you provide potential people in your cover letter, that's actually useful for us. However, when you do that, you need to make sure that you don't have any conflicts of interest that I might be aware of. I mean, obviously, you should not give people that have conflicts. You shouldn't suggest your best friend. But I wouldn't necessarily know that it's your best friend unless you have co-published with them. So we look for co-authorship conflicts. So if you published with someone in the past, or if that person was your old PI or something, then we probably will not use that person. But if we don't see any conflicts, then we would use them. But I would never only use them. Like if I have 3 reviewers for a manuscript, I would probably use 1 suggested and then 2 that I found on my own, just in case this one, even though I checked for co-authorship conflicts, I couldn't check for all conflicts, right? So it's a balance, the way we do it.
Okay. Okay, so any other questions from anyone that would like to have a question live? We still have a couple more minutes from the participants, students. Some of the students, they are learning to write their own papers, right? But we want to encourage everyone, well, at least when we are training undergraduates, to finish up what you did in research as a paper, right? So that experience of writing your thoughts and analyzing data will be one of the milestones that will achieve later on, grantmanship and also writing skills that will make you successful. Because obviously, as you mentioned, a paper that is not well written will immediately bring the first tier of editorial cut, right? So
Yeah.
that's also an issue, I imagine.
And actually, I'm really glad that you brought this up, just because we are specifically told, like, this is an instruction that we're giving. We're not supposed to reject a manuscript because it's written in poor grammar, for example. We're not judging grammar.
Mm-hmm.
But I get told this by my boss. Like, this is a thing, right? I can never reject something based on grammar. You'll be surprised how many reviewers, PIs, I get that simply state, this sounds interesting, but it's written so poorly that I cannot understand it, therefore reject.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm not trying to be critical of the referees, but I'm just trying to say anyone should be able to understand the science, regardless of, like, oh, they used the wrong article here, you know what I mean?
Sí.
But somehow, in the mind of some individuals, it's really hard to overcome that at first, like, initial. And I'm not saying that they're doing it right. I think they're doing it wrong, but still, I cannot change them. And because of that, what I can do is tell my authors, please be careful when you write your manuscript, and make sure, because people are going to be judgmental no matter what.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's very important for students to really practice the skill until it's perfected. And I think there's really good courses at Coursera for writing science manuscripts, and I really encourage people to do that. I actually did that myself, because writing science is really different from writing other types of work, I think. And that's a way that you can maximize the impact of your work, for sure.
2 more questions. In your Nature journal cascade, how do the impact factors change with one up to the next?
So, as part of the Nature Research Group, we are trying to move away from impact factors as a company. But it is true, and we're not trying to publicly announce, so we don't try to use that as advertisement for our journals. However, it is true that the more selective journals have a higher impact factor than the less selective journals. So I don't know if Nature has an impact factor of 40 or 50, and it keeps going then down there through the cascade. I think that's just a natural process, just based on the amount of manuscripts one publishes. And I think it's also scientists are also a lot to do with this. I like to say sometimes, and I don't know if I should say this because I'm working for the company, but I feel like sometimes companies and publishers also have what I call the Balenciaga effect, which is like, now you have a brand name and now people like it regardless of what you're selling. I remember there was this meme a while back of this very expensive bag that looked like an IKEA bag, and it was like $4,000, Balenciaga brand. I don't know anything about branding, but I think so. It's a mixture of what scientists want and also what we curate as editors. Yeah, and we can talk a lot more about that. If I go to Puerto Rico, we can talk about that over beers, because there's a lot of things that we need to discuss on that point. And it's an interesting point, but we're really trying to shy away from impact factors as much as we can.
Okay, and then there's this final question. What is the rule of thumb for Nature publications? Does it require several techniques that run the gamut from behavioral to molecular?
What is the rule of thumb for Nature publications?
So in that paper, do you need to have, the behavior, molecular,
I see.
how thorough, how many techniques?
That's a good question. And I think this largely depends on the field of study. So let's say if you are a systems person or a neural circuits person, then probably yes, you'll have to do physiology, behavior, and then maybe some, I don't know, genetic knockout or knock-in. There are other fields of study where maybe that's not as possible. Like, for example, if you're studying learning in pigeons, we still cannot really control like the genes in these animals as well. Although there are some, new papers that are doing this, or in songbirds, I think it's the latest one. So I think to answer your question, that really largely depends on your field and what is state of the art in your field. And I think the best way to know this is really looking at what you are doing and seeing what the journal you're interested in publishing is publishing on that area. So, and I think that's really what you should be, how you should be comparing of what kind of is expected if you want to fit this editorial niche. That's my best suggestion, because it's really hard to use that one rule for every paper. So my best suggestion is it goes by fields, and you should look in a specific journal, what is it that they're requesting of each field, because it varies.
Okay. Well, I think we finished all the questions as you see in the chat, and then thank you so much, Yomayra. It was a pleasure to have you to finish our seminar series. This is our last BP Endure Summer Series seminar, and it's been a wonderful journey. We are hoping that to continue for the academic year, if we get others to join this initiative. And so thank you so much, and all the best for you in New York and in Nature. And we will be requesting for everyone that can to send their evaluations that we'll be sending via email, for us to know how good we did and how can we improve these kinds of activities that I know have been quite impactful. So any feedback will be wonderful, and we really appreciate it. So, gracias, Yomayra. Cuídate mucho.
Gracias a ustedes por invitarme. Fue un placer y un honor.
Gracias. Well, thank you, everyone. So I guess I'll see you. Thank you, guys.